The air in the small village was alive with the scent of roasted corn, sizzling pakoras, and fresh jalebis dripping with syrup. Lanterns hung from every corner, swaying gently in the evening breeze, casting a warm golden glow across the bustling fairground. The annual village fair was the biggest event of the year, a tradition that drew families, friends, and even strangers from nearby towns. Laughter rang out from the carousel, and the sharp clang of the blacksmith's game mixed with the lilting notes of a flute somewhere in the distance. Arav walked through the crowd, his hands tucked into his kurta pockets, taking in the energy of the place. Children ran past him, clutching cotton candy bigger than their heads, their excited chatter blending into the hum of conversation. Women in bright saris bargained at stalls selling colorful bangles, handmade quilts, and brass trinkets that glimmered under the lantern light. Men stood in groups near the tea stalls, sipping steaming cups and exchanging stories of the year gone by. It was then, as he passed the ring toss game, that he saw her. She stood a little apart from the crowd, in a simple yellow salwar kameez that seemed to glow even more in the light of the lanterns. The yellow was soft, not loud, but on her, it shone like the first light of dawn. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose braid, and her wrists jingled with thin glass bangles that caught and reflected the flicker of the fair's lamps. She was leaning slightly forward, watching her younger brother aim a ring toward a wooden peg painted bright red. Almost there, Amen, she encouraged, her voice warm and filled with a kind of patient joy. Arav noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the way she crouched down to her brother's level to offer advice on his throw. It was a small, ordinary moment, and yet, something about it felt extraordinary. For reasons he couldn't explain, Arav found himself rooted to the spot. It wasn't just her beauty, though it was undeniable. It was the way she seemed to exist, completely in the moment, her attention entirely on the boy beside her. She wasn't distracted by the chaos around her, the noise, the flashing colors, the chatter. She was focused, present, and kind. And that, to him, was rare. Amen threw another ring, and this time it landed perfectly on the peg. The stall owner clapped his hands and handed over a small stuffed elephant as a prize. Anaya's laughter rang out, soft and musical, as she took the toy and handed it to her brother. Told you we'd get it, she said. Arav realized then that he didn't even know her name, yet she had already taken a place in his thoughts. He caught himself staring, and quickly looked away, pretending to examine a nearby stall selling wooden flutes. Still, his gaze drifted back, as if pulled by something stronger than his own will. She noticed him. Just for a second, her eyes met, his curious, but not shy. It wasn't a long look, but it was enough to send a strange flutter through his chest. Then Amin tugged at her hand, and she turned away, heading toward the food stalls. Arav hesitated, his mind buzzing. Should he follow? Introduce himself? What would he even say? He wasn't the kind of man who struck up conversations with strangers, but something about her made him want to step out of his comfort zone. He trailed behind at a respectful distance, watching as she bought 2 paper cones of hot jalebis. The vendor poured extra syrup over them, and she laughed as a drop nearly spilled onto her sleeve. Her joy seemed unrestrained, as though she wasn't aware of the effect it had on the people around her, including him. The night grew cooler as the fair went on. The Ferris wheel turned slowly in the background, its lights blinking like stars. Somewhere, a singer began a folk song, and the melody carried over the crowd. Arav knew the fair would end soon, and with it, maybe his chance to ever see her again. He didn't know why it mattered so much, this girl whose name he didn't know, whose story was still a mystery. But as she walked away with her brother, disappearing into the crowd, he felt an unfamiliar tug in his heart. Something told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. A week had passed since the fair, yet Arav still found himself thinking about the girl in the yellow salwar kameez. Sometimes it was her laughter that replayed in his mind, sometimes the quiet warmth in her eyes. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something about her presence had carved a quiet space inside his thoughts, a space he couldn't seem to fill with anything else. One warm afternoon, Arav was driving his tractor back from the market with sacks of wheat, when it suddenly sputtered and coughed, coming to a halt right beside a cluster of green fields. He got down, wiping the sweat from his brow, and bent over to check the engine. The sun beat down mercilessly and his shirt clung to his back. That's when he heard footsteps crunching lightly on the dry path. Pani Chahi? He looked up, and froze.it was her. The girl from the fair. She was standing just a few feet away, a brass loda in one hand and a curious, slightly cautious expression on her face. Her braids swung gently as the breeze passed, and the sunlight caught on the glass bangles at her wrist. The yellow of the fair was gone. Today, she wore a soft green cotton suit, the kind that seemed to carry the scent of the fields themselves. For a moment, Arif forgot how to speak. Gee, Han, Shukriya, he managed, his voice rough from both the heat and the surprise. She stepped closer, holding out the loda. Their fingers brushed briefly as he took it, and that single accidental touch sent an unexpected jolt through him. The water was cool, sweeter than anything he'd tasted all day, but it was her nearness that left him feeling oddly breathless. Tractor Karab Hogaya? She asked, her tone polite but her eyes watching him closely. Han, log to high kutch. Engine ka mazla hai. Bas dek rahahun, he replied, setting the loda down on the tractor's side and crouching to examine the machine again. She nodded but didn't move away immediately. Instead, she stood there for a few more seconds, as if deciding whether to say something else. Then her brother's voice called out from the distance, and she glanced over her shoulder. Mujjana chahi, she said softly, almost as if she was apologizing for leaving. Gee, Arif replied, wishing he had the courage to ask her name right then and there. But before he could, she was already walking back across the narrow path that separated the road from her family's fields. The green stalks swayed around her as she disappeared into the distance. Arif stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the faint jingling of her bangles until even that faded. Then, with a half smile, he didn't quite understand. He turned back to fixing the tractor. That short exchange, just a few words, a shy smile, and the offering of water stayed with him long after he reached home. That evening, as he sat on the charpoy outside his house, his mother asked him why. He seemed lost in thought. He simply shook his head and smiled, unwilling to explain. But in the days that followed, Arif found himself taking the longer route whenever he went to the market, a route that conveniently passed by her family's fields. Sometimes he'd see her in the distance, carrying a bundle of fodder on her head, or walking with her brother, or filling water at the well. He never stopped her, never called out, just watched from afar, feeling oddly content with those stolen glimpses. Yet each time he saw her, the quiet pull inside him grew stronger. It wasn't just attraction. It was curiosity, respect, and something that felt dangerously close to longing. Arif didn't know if fate would give him another chance to speak to her properly, but a small voice inside him, the same voice that had made him glance twice at the fair, told him this wasn't the end. In fact, it might only be the beginning. The village had its own quiet rhythm, the mornings filled with the calls of roosters, the afternoons heavy with the hum of cicadas, and the evenings alive with the chatter of neighbors sitting under neem trees. Within that rhythm, Arif and Anaya's paths began to cross more often. It was never arranged, never spoken about, yet somehow, they would find themselves at the same places, a coincidence too frequent to ignore. Sometimes it was at the well in the early hours, when the mist still clung to the fields. Arif would be filling his loda for the day, and Anaya would arrive with her brass pot balanced effortlessly on her hip. She would greet him with a soft namaste, her eyes dipping shyly before meeting his for the briefest moment. He would return the greeting, trying not to linger too long on the way. Her smile seemed to light up the dullest morning. Other times, they met at the small local market. Arif, bargaining for jaggery, would notice her a few stalls away, choosing vegetables. With her mother, their eyes would meet in the middle of the noisy, crowded lane, and for a few seconds, the world around them would fade. Neither spoke in those moments, but both felt a subtle tug, like a thread, pulling them closer each time. Over time, small gestures began to bridge the space between them. Arif started bringing fresh mangoes from his orchard, stopping by her family's home under the pretense of giving some to her father. He would hand the basket over, and though most of the conversation was polite and directed toward the elders, his eyes would search for hers, catching her watching him from the doorway. Anaya, in her own quiet way, began to give back. On days when Arif worked late in the fields, she would send her younger brother with a tiffin filled with warm parathas, wrapped carefully so they stayed soft. Arif would open the tiffin under the shade of a tree, the aroma reminding him instantly of her presence. It was a small thing, yet it warmed him more than the afternoon sun ever could. Their conversations, when they happened, were short, a few words about the weather, the crops, or the village festival that was coming up. But their silences spoke louder, a glance that lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, the way her fingers would briefly brush his when passing something, the way he would pause mid-task just to watch her walk away. All these little moments carried an unspoken promise. Arav began to notice things about her that no one else seemed to. How she always tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous. How her laughter, though rare in his presence, was soft and unguarded when she spoke with her younger brother. How she would always choose to stand in the sunlight as if she belonged in brightness. Anaya, too, began to notice things about him. The way he always offered help to the elders without being asked. The faint scar on his left hand, which he absent-mindedly touched when lost in thought. The way his eyes softened whenever he looked at her, even if only for a moment. In the village, where everyone knew everyone's business, such things rarely went unnoticed. Whispers began to spread, especially among the women at the well. But Arav and Anaya seemed untouched by them, as if they existed in a small private world that the rest of the village could only guess at. Still, neither of them spoke of what they felt. Perhaps it was the fear of breaking the delicate magic that seemed to surround their meetings. Perhaps it was the knowledge that in a place like theirs, feelings carried consequences. Whatever the reason, they were content for now to let their hearts speak in glances, in gestures, in the quiet giving and receiving of small kindnesses. One evening, as Arav walked home carrying an empty tiffin Anaya had sent, the sky above the fields turned a shade of orange and pink. He paused for a moment, watching the horizon. There was a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't name it, but deep down, he knew exactly what it was. And miles away, Anaya sat by the courtyard, peeling mangoes. She smiled to herself without realizing it. Neither said the word love, but in their own quiet ways, they had already begun to live it. The village was alive with colors that night. Strings of marigolds hung from every doorway, claydias lined the narrow lanes, and the air was thick with the scent of incense and fresh sweets. Children ran about with sparklers, their laughter mingling with the distant sound of drums and temple bells. Diwali had arrived the night when the whole village seemed to glow. Arav walked through the crowd slowly, his eyes scanning the lively scene. Families were gathered in their courtyards, lighting rows of lamps. Women in bright saris moved gracefully, carrying trays of sweets. Shopkeepers stood at their stalls, selling everything from firecrackers to bangles. But despite the beauty all around him, Arav's thoughts were elsewhere. He was looking for just one person, and then he saw her. Anaya stood near the temple steps, talking softly to her cousin. She wore a deep red sari that caught the light of the flickering diyas, each pleat falling perfectly against her frame. Her long hair was adorned with a string of jasmine flowers, the white petals a striking contrast against the darkness of her hair. She looked radiant, as if she were part of the festival itself. For a moment, Arav forgot the noise, the people, even the festival. It was just her framed by the glow of the lamps, her bangles chiming softly as she gestured while speaking. His heart, already unsteady around her, seemed to quicken, summoning courage he didn't know he had. He walked toward her. She noticed him only when he was a few steps away, her eyes widening slightly before a soft smile curved her lips. Namaste, Arav, she greeted, her voice barely rising above the temple bells. Namaste, he replied, his throat suddenly dry. For a moment, they stood quietly, watching children light small firecrackers nearby. The sparks flew into the air, bursting into tiny showers of gold. Arav glanced at her, noticing how the firelight reflected in her eyes, making them shimmer. Diwali suits you, he said softly. Or maybe, you make Diwali look more beautiful. Her cheeks turned a shade deeper than her sari. She lowered her gaze, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Arav could feel his own pulse racing. But something about the night, the warmth of the lights, the music, the magic in the air made him braver than usual. Anaya, he began, the words tumbling in his mind before finding their way out. I think my days are brighter because of you. She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made the noise around them fade into silence. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. A small smile touched her lips. She didn't answer right away, as if she were weighing the moment, letting it sink in. Finally, she said, and I think mine are too. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more than any loud declaration could. The temple bells rang louder then, almost as if the night itself was marking the moment. They didn't hold hands, not yet, but the closeness between them felt tangible, like a thread connecting them in the middle of the crowd. They walked together toward the main square, where the biggest fireworks were being set off. Standing side by side, they looked up as colors exploded in the night sky, reds, golds, and blues painting the darkness. Arav glanced at her once more, watching how her face lit up with every burst of light. In that moment, he didn't need any more words. Her presence, her smile, the way she stood beside him. It was all the answer he needed. Later, when the fireworks began to fade and the crowd slowly dispersed, Arav walked her to the edge of the temple steps. Neither wanted to say goodbye, but the night was drawing to a close. "Good night, Arav," she said, her smile lingering even as she turned to leave. "Good night, Anaya," he replied, watching her disappear into the lantern-lit path. As he made his way home, the air still smelled of jasmine and fireworks, and in his heart, a quiet certainty had taken root. This night had changed something between them forever. In a small village, news traveled faster than the wind. What began as quiet glances and chance meetings between Arav and Anaya soon became the subject of hushed conversations behind closed doors. By the time a week had passed since the Diwali night, almost everyone knew or thought they knew that something was blooming between them, but not everyone welcomed it. Arav came from a family known for generations of farming, respected, hardworking, but rooted deeply in tradition. Anaya's family, though also from the village, came from a different background, one associated with trade and business. While these differences might seem small to outsiders, in the close-knit and often rigid village society, they were enough to draw lines that people believe should not be crossed. It started with subtle changes. When Arav passed by Anaya's lane, the same neighbors who once greeted him warmly now looked away or whispered to each other. Some stared openly, their expressions laced with curiosity or disapproval. At the market, Arav overheard snippets of conversation. "They're getting too close. This will only lead to trouble," words meant to be just loud enough for him to hear. Anaya faced her own share of the storm. Her mother's gentle questions became sharper. "You've been outside too often lately. Is there something you're not telling us?" Her father's silence at dinner spoke volumes. Even her younger brother, once eager to talk about Arav, seemed quieter, perhaps sensing the tension in the house. Meetings between Arav and Anaya grew harder to arrange. Where once they could talk freely at the well or in the market, now they had to be careful, choosing secluded paths or waiting for rare moments when no one was watching. Conversations that once flowed easily were now short, interrupted by the fear of being seen. But in those brief exchanges, their eyes spoke louder than ever before. One late afternoon, Arav waited under the old banyan tree near the edge of the fields. The golden light of sunset filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows on the ground. Anaya arrived quietly, her dupatta pulled over her head, her steps quick and cautious. "They're talking about us," she said, her voice low, her eyes scanning the empty path behind her. "I know," Arav replied, his jaw tightening. "Let them talk. It's not that simple," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You know how our families are. They'll never agree." "Not like this." Arav reached for her hand, holding it gently but firmly. "Anaya, I don't care what they say. I care about you, and I won't let them scare me away." For a moment, she didn't speak. The only sounds were the rustle of the leaves and the distant call of a cowherd. Then she looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with both fear and hope. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "You won't," he said. "Not while I have a say in it." But as the days turned into weeks, the tension only grew. Once friendly elders began dropping hints to Arav's parents about keeping their son in line. Anaya's relatives started mentioning proposals from suitable families. Even the village priest made a passing comment about young hearts needing guidance. The unspoken pressure was like a storm cloud hanging over them, heavy, unrelenting, and always threatening to break. Yet, despite the growing distance between their meetings, the love in their eyes remained unchanged. When they crossed paths unexpectedly, him delivering grain to the market, her buying flowers for her mother, they shared quick smiles, stolen glances, and a silent promise that this wasn't the end. One evening, as a real storm brewed in the skies, with dark clouds rolling in and the wind picking up, Arav stood outside, watching the first drops of rain fall on the parched earth. The weather seemed to mirror his own turmoil. Restless, unsettled, on the brink of something big. Somewhere in the village, he knew, Anaya was looking out at the same storm, thinking of him, And in that moment, despite the fear, the whispers, and the walls closing in around them, Erev felt certain of one thing: love, like rain, could not be stopped. The sun was dipping low, painting the horizon in shades of gold and orange. The warm evening breeze carried the scent of earth and blooming marigolds from nearby fields. Erev stood beneath the old neem tree, its sprawling branches casting long shadows over the dusty ground. This was their place, the one corner of the village where the world seemed to forget about them, and they could just be two people in love. He could hear the faint chirping of crickets starting up in the distance. And every few seconds, his eyes darted toward the path leading from Anaya's house. He knew she would come. She always did. A few minutes later, he saw her. Anaya's yellow dupatta trailed in the wind, her steps quick but graceful. She glanced over her shoulder once, making sure no one had followed, before finally reaching him. The moment their eyes met, Erev felt his chest tighten, a mixture of relief, love, and determination. Without a word, he reached for her hand. Her fingers trembled as they intertwined with his, but she didn't pull away. The neem leaves above rustled gently, like nature itself was listening. Anaya, his voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. I can't let this end because of what people say. I've been thinking about it every day, every night. And no matter how hard it gets, I don't want to walk away from you. She looked at him, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the weight of everything they had been through. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I know the world won't make this easy. Our families, the village, they will try to stop us, but I'm not afraid of them. I'm only afraid of losing you. So I'm asking you now, here, where it's just the two of us, will you stand by me? A tear rolled down her cheek, glistening in the fading sunlight. She blinked, her chest rising and falling with emotion. Erev, you know what this means? Once we decide, there's no turning back. We'll have to face them all. I know, he said firmly, and I'm ready. As long as I have you beside me, I'll face anything. For a moment, silence wrapped around them. The air seemed still, heavy with the importance of what they were about to choose. Then, slowly, Anaya nodded. Yes, she whispered, her voice shaking but sure. I'll stand by you. It was such a small movement, that nod, yet it felt like the earth beneath them shifted. Erev pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if by sheer strength. He could shield her from every cruel word and disapproving glance. She buried her face in his chest, and for those few seconds, the rest of the world didn't exist. When they finally stepped back, Erev took both her hands in his. Then it's decided. No matter what comes, we face it together. She smiled through her tears. Together, she repeated, as if sealing the promise. The sky was now streaked with pink and deepening purple. A flock of birds flew overhead, their silhouettes breaking across the fading light. The neem tree swayed gently above them, the sound of its leaves whispering like a blessing. Before parting, they talked in hushed tones about what might come next. They knew they couldn't hide forever. There would be questions, confrontations, maybe even threats. But their decision had given them something far stronger than fear. It had given them clarity. Erev watched her walk back down the narrow path toward her home, her figure slowly fading into the dusk. He felt the urge to call after her, to say one more thing, but he didn't. They both knew the weight of what they had promised tonight. As he turned toward his own house, Erev felt lighter, despite the challenges ahead. For the first time in weeks, his heart wasn't burdened with uncertainty. They had chosen each other, and that, he thought, was worth everything. Months passed, each day testing the strength of their decision. There were long talks behind closed doors, heated debates over dinner tables, and more than a few moments when it seemed like giving up might be easier. But neither Erev nor Anaya wavered. Every stolen glance in the market, every secret meeting under the neem tree reminded them of what they were fighting for. At first, the resistance was fierce. Erev's father was stubborn, unwilling to bend to village traditions. Anaya's mother worried about the whispers, about how the neighbors would talk. Yet, persistence has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. Erev visited Anaya's family often, helping her father in the fields, sharing quiet conversations with her brothers, showing them with his actions that his love was real. Anaya, in turn, spoke gently to her parents about Erev's kindness, his honesty, and how deeply he cared. The turning point came one cool winter evening. Both families had gathered, still tense, but willing to listen. Erev stood tall and spoke with the steady voice of a man who knew his heart. I will honor her, protect her, and build a life where she is loved every day. I'm not asking for your approval for the sake of tradition, I'm asking because she is my future. Silence filled the room. Then, slowly, Anaya's father looked at Erev, his eyes softening. If you can promise to keep her happy, then I have no reason to stand in your way. Erev glanced at Anaya, who sat quietly beside her mother, her hands clasped in her lap, and in that moment, he saw the tears of relief gathering in her eyes. From that day, preparations began. The wedding was to be held in the open fields, the very place where their story had quietly begun months ago. It was a poetic choice, a reminder of their journey from chance glances to lifelong vows. The village buzzed with activity. Women strung marigold garlands, men set up bamboo frames for the canopy, and children ran around carrying baskets of flowers. On the morning of the wedding, the sun rose over the fields, bathing everything in a soft golden glow. The air was filled with the scent of fresh blooms and the sound of doll beats echoing through the village. Erev arrived dressed in a cream-colored sherwani, his smile unshakable. He greeted guests, but his eyes kept searching for one face. When Anaya finally stepped into view, the world seemed to pause. She wore a red bridal lehenga embroidered with gold, her dupatta draped gracefully over her head. Jasmine flowers were woven into her braid, their fragrance mingling with the scent of marigolds. As she walked toward him, the soft crunch of petals under her feet, Erev felt the same pull he had the very first time he saw her at the village fair. Only now, she was walking toward him, not as a dream, but as his bride. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Family members blessed them, friends cheered, and the village gathered to witness the union. Under the canopy of marigolds and fairy lights, Erev took Anaya's hand and whispered, "This is where our forever begins." She looked at him with a smile that said she had never been more certain of anything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fields came alive with warm light. Fairy lights twinkled like stars brought down to earth, and the laughter of guests filled the air. Children danced around the bonfire, elders exchanged stories, and the newlyweds sat side by side, hands intertwined, soaking in the joy of the moment. For Erev, the day wasn't just a wedding, it was the culmination of every risk they had taken, every moment they had chosen each other despite the odds. For Anaya, it was proof that love could endure whispers, weather storms, and still bloom like the marigolds that surrounded them. That night, as they stood at the edge of the fields looking up at the sky, Erev turned to her and said softly, "They were wrong, you know." She tilted her head. "Who?" "Those who said love like ours couldn't last. Because here we are." Anaya's smile glowed in the starlight. "Here we are," she echoed, leaning into him, and in the heart of their small village, under a canopy of stars, Erev and Anaya began a new chapter, one that promised to last a lifetime.